Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Tere hommikust. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to get a chance to come to Estonia during a time of year when I usually can't come. I'm busy teaching and working with students, but this was a real pleasure. And you might notice that what you read in the program booklet about what I was thinking about speaking about changed a little bit as I, over the past month or so, started working on this talk and went back in my memory and figured that I would get the chance to write about this very interesting aspect of Estonian speech and song culture. So what I'll talk about today varies a little bit from the abstract that I sent in a while ago, but I hope you'll still find it interesting, and I really invite and look forward to feedback and more ideas. Many of you in the room here know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm very interested to get some feedback and ideas as I share these thoughts today. So I'd like to talk this morning about what's called the vocal turn in music studies, sound and media studies, philosophy, and other humanistic disciplines, and what potential it holds for our conference theme, the personal and communal aspects of traditional singing. Setting aside for now what we mean by traditional singing, as opposed to other kinds of vocal expression, the turn to voice has meant rethinking how the sonic, the social, and the body intersect in song. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate on the phenomenon of ingressive phonation, speaking and singing while breathing in spoken Estonian and the Estonian regilaul tradition, the rich poetic and melodic tradition that is so wonderfully preserved and cultivated in this very institution. My main points will be the following. First, that there is continuity in terms of phonation and gendered ideologies of voice between ingressive speech and ingressive singing in Estonian, although their functions, as we'll see, are quite different. Second, that paying attention to the embodied aspects of voice as they materialize in sound give us new perspectives on the gender and genre ideologies that shape regilaul as a practice, as a living tradition of voice, language, and embodied knowledge. And third, that attending to voice and embodiment in Estonian speech and regilaul is a critical move in making sound a central part of our thinking about these oral practices. In terms of our conference themes, then, my talk today is a reminder that the vocal body and the voice that speaks and sings are where the personal and communal aspects of singing intersect. Practicing a tradition and inhabiting a genre mean that the personal, the voice, the body is always already in a feedback loop with the communal. The communal values that shape vocal timbre or the paralinguistic codes of speaking are known in one's body, and that embodied knowledge can be heard in the voice. I'll start by spending a little time talking about voice studies and some of the thinking about voice that has influenced my approach to ingressive phonation in Estonian. Voice is a material aspect of the body. It is the vibration of vocal cords in the larynx, the shaping of resonant cavities in the mouth, throat, and head, and the control of muscle tension throughout the body. Curiously enough, speaking and singing are not the primary functions of any of the organs associated with voice. Lungs are for exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. The tongue is for swallowing. Vocal cords are to prevent choking. Teeth are for chewing, and so on. Voice, then, is a communicative and expressive affordance of a body working first and foremost on other things. Voice is also inherently social, not only as a medium for speech and song, but in its paralinguistic dimensions as well. These paralinguistic dimensions are what the theorist Roland Barthes famously describes as the grain of the voice, by which he means, quote, the encounter between a language and a voice, the materiality of the body speaking its mother tongue. Voice is not the immaterial medium of language and speech, nor is it the incidental bearer of melody as it's transcribed or notated. Rather, voice constantly connects language, speech, and song to the body through the individuality of timbre and the sounds of the material vocal apparatus, breath, saliva, physical strain. In the voice studies literature I'm in conversation with today, the connection of vocal sound and the body produces what the literature scholar Stephen Connor calls the vocalic body, quote, an imaginary body which may contradict, compete with, replace, or even reshape the actual visible body of the speaker. The vocalic body, which is distinct but not entirely apart from the actual body of a speaker or singer, comes into being through the social resonances of accent, fundamental speaking or vocalizing frequency, vocal timbre, and style, all of which invoice actual or stereotyped identities. Especially when the voice is acousmatic, meaning that the actual body of a speaker or singer is not visible, like on a recording, or off camera, or around a corner, or in darkness. The vocalic body becomes the object of complex sonic identifications. The characteristic sounds of a voice mean that gender, ethnic, generational, and racialized identities, regional background, and class status each connect back to what the anthropologist Nick Harkness calls the phonosonic nexus of voice. By phonosonic nexus, Harkness means the ways in which phonic production through speech and song shape and are shaped by the social meanings of vocal sound and its reception. Our speaking and singing sounds the way it does because of the communities we're a part of, the ways our bodies are and change over time, and the ways we want to voice ourselves into new, alternative social identities. There's another way that voice is something inherently social as well. Having a voice, in the metaphorical sense of having agency, or in the Enlightenment sense of being an autonomous subject, connects the vocalic body to a political order and repertoire of cultural practices. So here we might think about the voice as having a vote. In Estonian, hääletamine, the word voice is right in there for political agency. The distinction of people's voices affords or excludes them from power, access, and privilege, as does their ability to reproduce dominant vocal ideologies. Think here of the renowned voices that construct our archives, the social advantages that come through speaking without an accent, and, relevant to the conference themes, the kind of body and subject that can reproduce a genre-appropriate voice and therefore participate in a singing community. On this last point, imagine the out-of-place nature of bel canto sound in any number of traditional singing cultures, or the difficulty of an idiomatic voice like Bob Dylan's or Björk's to cross over into certain other genres. What this gets at, and what I will turn to shortly, is that the world of genre and tradition are maintained by what the musicologist Nina Eidsheim calls singers' timbral labor, the, quote, inner choreographies of breath and muscle that produce a voice that is deemed culturally appropriate. To wrap up this introduction, my point is a simple one. Voice is an artifact of embodied knowledge that is in a feedback loop with traditions, social identities, ritual roles, and technologies. The idiomatic sound of a voice and the identities it mediates emerge through inner choreographies of the body that are always already social. Voice and the vocalic body are social. Speaking and singing are the voicings of relationships. Okay, so now to focus on the Estonian vocal practices that I'm interested in. For those of you who are Estonian or have spent some time in Estonia or Sweden, as you'll hear, or Finland, as you'll hear, you may have noticed how some Estonians, usually women, use pulmonic ingressive phonation in certain communicative contexts. By ingressive pulmonic phonation, I mean the sound produced during inhalation, something like this. Yeah. Don't take my word for it, however. Here are some examples of what I mean.
Ja, aga kui kaugel te praegu olete? Eesti piirist üle praegu, siis läheb jah palju. 2 tundi. Ja küll ega midagi, kui siiani oleme oodanud, siis jõuab.
Yeah. Seems like you know what I mean. There are arguably almost no languages in the world with ingressive phonemes, according to the linguistic literature. As a paralinguistic feature, pulmonic phonation is relatively rare in a comparative context, although it's quite common throughout Scandinavia, as the cultural linguist Robert Eklund has documented. Glottalic ingressive phonation and velaric ingressive phonation are, on the other hand, quite common globally. Ingressive speech is often associated with the emotional extremes of crying, pain, and laughter, or with the urge to continue speaking while running out of breath. Well-known examples of ingressive singing range from Inuit throat games to laments to the experimental vocal practices of somebody like Meredith Monk. In a 1958 article on laryngeal vibration, Moore and von Leyden note that, quote, inspiratory vocalization can be produced by anyone with a normal larynx, and it is heard frequently in laughter, crying, rapid emotional speech, and children's vocal play. In general theories of ingressive phonation, then, it is linked to expressions of pain and pleasure. Other examples of ingressive phonation are ventriloquism, voice disguise, shamanic speech, and, quite beautifully, the sound of kisses. And, of course, there is ingressive phonation in the Estonian Regilao singing tradition. Phenomenologically, ingressive speech and song uses cooler, drier, oxygen-rich air from outside the body to produce vibration, rather than warm, moist, oxygen-depleted air from the lungs. The larynx is asked to vibrate opposite its more efficient mode of egressive phonation, meaning one can't speak or sing ingressively as long or with as much phonetic control. Despite its rarity, ingressive speech is common enough in Estonia that it is considered a meaningful paralinguistic aspect of oral transcription. For example, the Tartu University Spoken Estonian Research Group, in developing an analytical corpus of spoken Estonian, uses a transcription method whereby ingressively phonated words are indicated by a period at the beginning of a word. You'll see that there at the end of the yellow box. Significantly, and this is something that accords with my fieldwork experience, this rubric indicates that multiple words in a row are spoken ingressively in Estonian, something which is even more unusual in comparative global context. Here's an example of multiple words being spoken ingressively in Estonian. The speaker is a 58-year-old Estonian woman, joined by a 37-year-old Estonian woman and a 59-year-old Estonian man. I'll do that one more time. As Eklund and the linguist Graham Shorrock's report, throughout Scandinavia, ingressive speech has two common functions, a confirming, empathetic function and a topic closing function. The confirming function of ingressive speech effects a shift in register. The way one says yes or yah accomplishes a pragmatic or context-determined shift in meaning. If you ask somebody to marry you, you probably don't want an ingressive yah, but in my experience, an ingressive yah in spoken Estonian signals empathy and intimacy. Here's an example of Eklund's confirming function, here with the same 58-year-old woman, talking about the sex of a soon-to-be baby, soon-to-be-born baby.
Kas poiss või tüdruk tuleb arvata? Tead?
Jah.
Kuidas?
Ta käis seal trellis.
One more time.
poiss või tüdruk tuleb arvama?
Tüdruk.
Tead?
Jah.
Kuidas?
Ta käis seal hotellis.
Here's the same Estonian woman talking about an acquaintance who was hospitalized and later died from a stroke. The first ja you'll hear is spoken egressively, since the topic of speech is still underway. After the whole story gets told, she closes with an ingressive ja as a paralinguistic signal of closure.
Ja, tal oli see... Ta oli lõpus ju seal Tallinnas ja Diakooni haiglas seal Hiiul. Ei olnud vähk, aga tal oli insult oli ka. Insult oli jah, nii et...
One more time.
Ja, tal oli see... Ta oli lõpus ju seal Tallinnas ja Diakooni haiglas seal Hiiul. Ei olnud vähk, aga tal oli insult oli ka.
In my experience, this kind of context-sensitive, ingressive closure happens in small groups of speakers and, contrary to the general literature on ingressive phonation, in situations of calm, emotional intensity. One closes the solemn report of an acquaintance's death with an ingressive ya. One wouldn't end an exasperated argument with an ingressive ya. So as you've noticed, ingressive speech in Estonian is strongly gendered. Although men do speak ingressively, it is predominantly an aspect of women's speech, a way that women across generations assume and reproduce gendered vocal roles and gendered vocal bodies in the worlds of Estonian speech. The technique of ingressive phonation, air flowing over the larynx in the opposite direction, producing inefficient vibration and a raspy sound with fewer formants and more noise, amplifies the embodied material apparatus of the voice through paralinguistic sound. In Estonian, the sound of ingressive speech draws attention to its embodiment and the gendering of a vocal body. This is sound that marks a social body as female. Ingressive speech is deeply connected to its pragmatic contexts as well. It doesn't happen everywhere, with everyone, or in relation to every topic. Eklund reports that in Sweden, ingressive speech is never used when speaking to machines, but is very often used when speaking to humans. Through ingressive phonation, we are reminded in an unusual way that the voice and the vocalic body are social. Speaking and singing are the voicings of identities and relationships. I'm going to pivot now into the world of Estonian regilaul. Here's an example of ingressive phonation in Estonian regilaul, Mareta laps, from Kadrina parish, likely taken from Herbert Tampere's monumental 1964 collection of narrative regilaul or Ülo Tetres and Veljo Tormis's 1975 popular regilaul collection. Here it's sung by Kärt Johansson.
Minu ella eidekane, minu ella eidekane, seitse tütarta sinula, seitse tütart sinula, kõik said naeseks naidetudki, kõik said seks naidetudki, üks jäi naeseks näitemata, üks jäi seks näitemata, Mareta kõreta neido, Mareta kõreta neido, see jäi naeseks näitemata.
I'll point out several details of Johansson's singing here. Obviously, she sings ingressively on particular syllables during the second iteration of each verse, although not always the same syllable within an octosyllabic verse. This is quite typical of the ingressive singing I've noticed in regilaul practice, since singers usually have enough breath to make it through the first iteration of a verse, but not the second or next verse when singing alone, regardless of the refrain structure of a given form. Also, with the verse already sung once, its words out there in the world, the ingressive syllable does not disturb the process of communication. When singing alone in lyrical call and response verse structures, the repetition of a verse is where the lead singer, eeslaulja, eestütleja, takes on the role of the responding choir, and the ingressive syllable is a condensed, amplified form of the lead singer's breathing that happens in collective regilaul practice. The impulse to sing ingressively that Johansson and many other regilaul singers express may relate to what musicologist Urve Lipus calls linear musical thinking, the tonal, rhythmic, and syntactic structures that define generative processes, in her words. What I would add here, however, is that the ingressive voice expresses linear musical thinking not at an abstract structural level of melodic type, rhythmic mode, or syllabic quantity, but at an embodied sonic level. This specific tradition of vocal practice is how singers inhabit the linearity or the groove of regilaul. These moments of ingressive singing express the impulse to maintain an unbroken melodic and rhythmic texture of call and response, to alternate between poetic presentation and poetic reflection in a seamless regilaul temporality, laulu ahel in Estonian, which is akin to what hip-hop artists and scholars might call flow. In a 2008 lecture here in Tartu, Veljo Tormis joked about the continuity impulse in regilaul, stating that, quote, "The first general rule is that in singing regilaul, one isn't allowed to breathe." The wisdom behind this joke, however, is that the impulse not to breathe connects to what Tormis calls the uninterrupted melodic pleasure, katkematu mõnu, of regilaul, and what Lipus might call part of the syntax of regilaul. When singing alone, ingressive singing in the middle of a repeated verse means that the transition to the next verse, the leegaius, is seamless and uninterrupted. This is a phenomenon that others remark on as well, stressing that breathing at the ends of verses, particularly when singing alone, is not the ideal practice. Looking at a spectrogram of Johansson's ingressive singing, we see a shift from the focused formants of egressive singing on a fundamental frequency of 230 hertz, right around here, to the white noise of ingressive singing on a much less present 230 hertz fundamental, this next little gap there in the middle where it's much more white noise. In terms of the relationship between signal and noise, ingressive singing is noisy. There is a significant amount of non-periodic white noise and much less sound focused around a discrete pitch. It is simply less musical or song-like if we take those terms to be pitch-centered and characterized by focused formants. Furthermore, the literature on ingressive phonation emphasizes that not all phonemes can be produced ingressively, meaning that some words or syllables cannot be accurately articulated ingressively, which may be why ingressive singing in Estonian regilaul happens on the repeated verse, after it's been heard in its entirety once. Sonically, ingressive singing amplifies the grain of the voice and materializes the vocalic body, as the larynx is made to vibrate in an inefficient mode and the mechanics of breathing, rather than the pitch and formant focus of singing, comes to characterize the sound. The continuity impulse regilaul singers express is an embodied practice that draws particular attention to itself through ingressive singing. Pitch, part of what makes the musical object we call melody, is obscured in ingressive singing, shifting attention away from the sonic aspects of the voice toward the mechanics of the voice. Similarly, individual syllables may or may not be properly articulated through ingressive singing, shifting attention away from the quantitative syllabic rhythm of regilaul toward a conception of regilaul as a breathing practice. Ingressive phonation in Estonian prioritizes paralinguistic expression. In the case of speech, and the continuity and impulse of regilaul in the case of singing. In both cases, correct phonation is sacrificed in order to give voice to gender and genre ideologies. In some discourses, ingressive speech genders female bodies in the most stereotyped of ways, although we could certainly have a lively discussion about this with so many experts in the room here. The pragmatic, context-specific functions of ingressive speech, expressing confirmation or empathy, closing off a topic, do indeed accord with my ethnographic experience. In regilaul, ingressive singing, while sharing many of the same sonic and gendered features of ingressive speaking, has rather different functions. What I'm calling the continuity impulse in regilaul, what singers and scholars talk about as its uninterrupted, katkematu, melodic poetic flow, is expressed precisely in the impulse to sing ingressively within verses, not between verses. This is a tradition of vocal practice preserved in archival recordings, alive in the oral tradition of regilaul today, but talked about quite rarely, at least in the research I've done. One occasionally hears about sissepoole hingates laulmine, singing while breathing in, but that's about all. This accords with my anecdotal ethnographic observations that Estonian speakers don't find ingressive speech remarkable, and they don't have a word for it readily at hand. What stands out to me in the world of Estonian regilaul, however, is that ingressive singing, whose function we can think of as expressing and maintaining a singer's continuity impulse, seems to be exclusive to regilaul. People don't sing while breathing in other genres. This seems to me quite important. Ingressive singing is a tradition of vocal practice and a materialization of a vocalic body deeply linked to genre and its ideological formations. In the discourses of regilaul, a core value is the uninterrupted melodic performance of poetic verses. This is contrasted with the phrase-based singing of other popular and concert vocal genres where the voice, always with an aesthetically appropriate timbre produced by the right inner choreographies of breath and muscle tension and resonance, is the medium of the musical object called melody. Phrase-based breathing in bel canto singing or Estonian popular song preserves the integrity of a musical object and emphasizes the sonic rather the embodied qualities of the voice. Ingressive singing in regilaul, on the other hand, expresses the value of uninterrupted melodic poetic performance, with aesthetic and timbral values associated with singing per se, subsumed into a singer's continuity impulse. The discourse of regilaul performance emphasizes something else than the sound of a voice. It emphasizes the expression of a regilaul continuity impulse, in which the raspy, phonetically imperfect, palpably embodied practice of ingressive singing is an expression of the vocal and genre ideologies of regilaul. In other words, ingressive singing links contemporary regilaul singing to the practice recorded in the archival record, creating continuity at another level, continuity in terms of an embodied vocal practice and an oblique connection to the ingressive phonation, presumably part of Estonian speech for centuries. Although I need to do more ethnographic research on this point, I suspect that ingressive singing is something of a chicken and egg phenomenon for regilaul singers. It is an iconic way of inhabiting the genre and its institutionalized prestige in discourses of Estonianness, either as the expression of a regilaul continuity impulse or as a way of entering into that embodied understanding of melodic poetic performance. You do it to express uninterrupted melodic poetic continuity, or you do it to come to know about uninterrupted melodic poetic continuity. Given its iconic relation to regilaul and everyday Estonian speech, ingressive phonation is a way of making the vocalic body an Estonian one. Here I'll play a few more examples. I believe one with one of our guests.
Meie sinna saame, musta kuused kuller saavad, mustala kuused kuller saavad, mustala kaased taller saavad, kaased taller saavad, sinna uhke uune elle, kõrgelle kaktuselle, kus meil suitsetu ja ruuba, kus suitsetu ja ruuba ja meil maitseb maagustanud ja meil maitseb maagustanud, Olle taabike ja liigub viinaklaasike ja liigub viinaklaasike.
Kun oletteesi kurvaline, ole ei kurna kurvaline, mõse ame aoelüle,
Ingressive singing in the world of Estonian regilaul is a unique enough phenomenon that it holds special potential to contribute in new ways to the broader field of voice studies. Conventionally, the voice has been treated as both a vanishing mediator in the process of communication and as a fetish object in the amplification of the voice in singing, to use the philosopher Mladen Dolar's formulations. The vocal turn in music and sound studies, philosophy, media studies, and other humanistic and social scientific disciplines is a reaction against the long arc of what the philosopher Adriano Cavarero describes as the devocalization of logos, by which he means the treatment of voice as that which is left over in the act of communication, the privileging of the said over the saying, the focus on concepts rather than their sonic medium. For music studies, Cavarero's devocalization of logos means that texts and transcriptions, devocalized singing, if you will, have enjoyed their disciplinary prestige at the expense of voice and its timbres, intonations, grain, and embodiment. What's missing, and what the vocal turn addresses, is the fact that language, speech, and song are sonic phenomena, and that those sounds are embodied and social. Timbre and grain and accent are difficult or undervalued things to get at analytically. And yet they are crucial to musical pleasure, the fullness of communication, and to understanding how gender and genre ideologies intersect with voice. Ingressive singing in Estonian regilaul brings us back to the critical point made by the scholar and sound artist Brandon Lebel. Here's the long quote. Language and voice are thus bound to the fact of our social experiences, which come to fundamentally shape our mouths, to contour the mother tongue with the particularities of dialect, and to impress upon the body a map of potential routes in and around vocal pressures for bending, flexing, silencing, or exaggerating our vocal alliances. These are the social and embodied grounds for thinking about the materiality of voice and sound in regilaul, and for exploring how genre and gender ideologies are inhabited by singing regilaul. Crucially, Estonian ingressive phonation is different than the fleeting references to ingressive phonation in the voice studies literature. In contrast to Labelle, who focuses on the gasp as a jarring vocal event when the mouth is broken open by the fright of breathlessness, ingressive speech and song in Estonian expresses something different. In speech, it is the voicing of agreement, empathy, and intimacy, a recognition that all that needs to be said has been said, and that the following silence can be a comfortable one, and that the vocal body resonates with the gender ideologies of Estonian speech. In Rahvaluule, ingressive singing is the voicing of a melodic and poetic sensibility that resonates with the discursive ideologies of the genre, that voice is not an aesthetic artifact apart from the uninterrupted flow of verses, that voice is the expression of embodied knowledge about the genre and its essential place in Estonian language and identity. So I have about 5 more minutes with some closing, 2 additional examples. So I'd like to close with 2 additional examples that extend the meanings and implications of ingressive phonation in Estonian. The first is a very well-known example from the Estonian choral literature, one of the Rantuška movements from Veljo Tormise's Ingrian Evenings, part of the Forgotten Peoples cycle of arrangements of Finno-Ugric traditional song. Here is a recording from the Karjala Institute of Language, Literature and History that Tormis used as source material. Obviously, ingressive phonation is an important part of this unnamed Ingrian woman's singing practice. It keeps the Rantuška dance rhythms moving, and it expresses the continuity impulse that characterizes Finno-Ugric traditional singing more broadly. In Tormis's hands, the ingressive phonation of a woman singing alone is humorously translated into the choral arrangement, where it is completely unnecessary in terms of maintaining an uninterrupted flow of melody and poetry and rhythm, since a choir could employ staggered breathing, ahel hingamine, just like in Rahvaluule practice when more than one person is singing or a choir is there to answer. Tormis calls this a joke, but I think there's an important lesson here too. Ingressive phonation is something remarkable in the world of Finno-Ugric singing, and here, where it's unnecessary, its connection to embodied knowledge of a Finno-Ugric voice is amplified. These collective moments of ingressive phonation cement an embodied connection to the vocal practice documented in the archive, not only an imagined connection through the transcription and arrangement of language and melody. This is a form of salvage ethnography on Tormis's part, with the added dimension of a Finno-Ugric vocalic body being conjured through its creative intervention. To bring this back to the voice studies literature, what is noteworthy here is the choral dimension, the value of arranging for ingressive phonation even though it's not necessary. As literature scholar Stephen Connor suggests, chorality creates new relationships between the personal and the communal as singers shape their voices with anticipatory assimilation into the aesthetic and ideology of the chorus. Individual voices are taken up into a collective vocalic body, one from many, in Connor's words. The vocalic body of the unnamed Ingrian woman singing the Rontushka on the archival field recording materializes again in the communal vocalic body of the chorus. Ingressive phonation, especially because it's not needed here, becomes a potent index of Finno-Ugric vocality. My second example, which points toward ideologies of voice beyond Estonian regilaul that nevertheless involve ingressive phonation, is something I encountered just a few weeks ago while listening to Estonian traditional musician Marja Nut's new album with the electronic musician Room. On a track called Une Meeles, or In the Hold of a Dream, Nut uses a traditional lullaby text found in any number of regilaul anthologies, but sings it on an oscillating, mesmerizing half-step over atmospheric vocal loops, not, I believe, using any recognizable regilaul melody. But as you'll hear, she uses ingressive phonation to create the uninterrupted flow that is valued in regilaul discourse. I sense an interesting shift here, one that points to the significance of the vocalic body in regilaul, even when that genre is being pushed in new directions. Nut's ingressive phonation is not an imitation of recorded voices in the archives the way Tormises is. Rather, Nut is using ingressive phonation to animate now familiar genre and gender ideologies in a vocalic body materialized through new sounds and traditional practices, a new relationship between the personal and the communal in traditional singing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was kind of mind-blowing for me as a scholar of calorimetric poetry in other areas. It's really interesting. But do we have questions, please?
You know, when I found out that I use it, I didn't know that a name for it, and probably I would, when I come back to Latvia, I have to think about it a little bit. And I usually use this ingressive singing when I sing in pulse, so I have to, I'm alone, and I usually sing when I'm quite quiet. So do you have records of loud singing with ingressive parts in Estonia, so then I can take care of?
So it doesn't come to mind. Others might know much more than I do. I think it is what so I haven't, this is kind of very new work for me that needs more research. What I have noticed is that it's very genre dependent, right? So that lyrical songs, lyrical genres are the ones where you find this practice more. Working songs, I think actually for obvious sort of physical reasons, it's hard to do manual labor and ingressively breathe and keep going. So nothing comes to mind, but you shouldn't take that answer as anything official. And I'd be curious if others have more understandings.
Our Latvian colleague, she said that such a singing style is familiar to her, but I doubt if it is typical for Lithuanian speaking and singing. I remember when I visited Norway for the first time. I lived in a family, And while speaking with my host, I noticed she's very surprised with everything I'm saying to her. We spoke about our family's ordinary life, and in our culture means that the person is surprised. And I said, I have 2 children. What? Boy and girl. What? I did not understand that it means yes. 2 children, oh yes. Oh yes, I see.
And I think
later I understood that social meaning of that exclamation.
And I think in the linguistics literature, I think what gets very special attention in, so there's a difference between like, and mita, right? Like, so the difference between a ingressive expression, a gasp, and then actually speaking a word ingressively. So that's a big, in the linguistics literature, that's a big distinction that draws a lot of attention. So it's less of a mannerism and more of like this people. It's a aspect of speaking in certain paralinguistic contexts. That's very interesting. I have a similar story when I first came to Estonia and having a conversation and with a older woman who would keep speaking. One of them. I don't know. She's one of the. It's one of the most marked people that I've seen, and at first I thought she had a health problem or something. I was worried, it would be like 3 or 4 words in a row, like, and it was sort of, it really. I was worried, and then I realized, oh, everyone does this. Okay, it's fine.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation.
Thanks.
I come from Sweden, and I was just having a reflection about when I listened to this Ingrian recording that was a while ago here. It struck me that she didn't really do it in a stable pulse. It was more about a kind of semi-pulse or something. And that is, then my reflection is that, as you also said, that this has to do with the conception of your aesthetic ideal, how you want this to be as a musical performance or whatever. And then I associate it actually to Jojk in the north of Sweden, where this is practiced, I think, and it's also music that is not in a pulse, it's more phrase, but you have this ingressive phonation also in that.
Yeah.
Actually, so that, if you haven't looked into that, that would be something, very interesting, I think, with these connections, with what you want to achieve with that practice. That's an interesting thing, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes.
I wanted to tell about how I found this ingressive phonation from quite unexpected situation. One of my students was learning Gregorian chant antiphon Ecce Virgo, which text goes Ecce Virgo concipiet et pariet filium, and I wanted him to sing it with one breath, and he couldn't, and he spontaneously Ecce Virgo concipiet, the end of clusil T, when you should exhale, he inhaled. Ecce Virgo concipiet et pariet filium, which I found really cool, and I never saw this before, and I'm now also using this, and I just wonder whether he had some kind of memory in his bones, because he's Estonian, to do this kind of concipiet, not concipiet. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, that's a great story. So I have 2 thoughts, and one is also sort of, well, I'll just say it. The first thought, the difference between D and T, it's actually one of these interesting phonemes that you can't produce egressive, so like t, right? Egressive T, it's plosive, dental plosive, right? So it has, you have that certain sound. Ingressively, you can't quite make the same phoneme. So like t or t, t. So there's, if we did a spectrogram analysis, it would look a little different. This is one of these interesting moments where there's some slippage between correct phonation ingressively and egressively. That's just a sort of interesting fact. I think one of the ways that I try to make some borders around what I talked about today versus what would probably the next step to take in this kind of research in regular practice, where it's not ingressive phonation, but people will just drop off the last syllable of a word rather than doing ingressive phonation. That's another way of keeping this continuity going, so that you drop off a syllable or two. There isn't ingressive phonation happening, it's just silence, and maybe the memory of what the word should be for native speakers or for those who have already heard the verse once. So that's another, that's like the next little baby step beyond this, what I spoke about today.
I think that these two aspects, the aspect of gender speech and this regular continuity, are somehow already mixed in contemporary performances. I think they use that exactly for such a bit, not the, of course, the ideological reason is the first one. That's our regular and that stylistic device, and Tormis introduced that and we all have to use it. Yes, but the second is really, they use microphone, they sing quite not like in wedding, yeah. And they give such intimate or something with this inhaling there too.
Yes.
These two aspects, they take from speech this aspect, and of course in our archive recordings, when you hear this inhaling, that's also connected to singing alone, singing in small room and so on.
Which is the sort of, so as I've been thinking about that, it's an artificial, because of the recording context, it's artificially alone.
You just don't have choir. But of course in Kihnu they are doing that, there is no lead singer and choir, they are singing all time together.
Yeah.
And they are, I think in our Kihnu recordings there are some women from which we can hear a bit this inhaling, but some are just making pause and when they are singing.
So thank you. Yeah, again, I think the next steps, because this had been a little thought in my mind for a decade, and then I finally wrote about it. What I haven't been able to do yet is actually do some ethnographic work, speaking with singers about what are you thinking, what are you doing when you do this. So that's the next thing I plan on doing, to really, this is not a full story until you speak with Marjanut or somebody about what's going on there. So that's absolutely the next step. I'm especially cautious about, being who I am, being quite cautious about weighing in too heavily about the gender issues, without hearing what people themselves think about that. So that's one idea I had. Yeah, I think in terms of, there's a long arc of newer regular singers where it is very much this studio context with voice processing and all these interesting things going on. It very much relates to other kinds of singing that emerged in the 20th century that are inconceivable without a microphone. So crooning, the way that loud breathing, so it's not ingressive phonation, but just singers who use their breathing as part of expressive practice. Again, that would reach nobody without a microphone, so the sort of prosthetic power of the microphone, it's an interesting intersection between 20th century technology and Rahvaluule tradition. But yeah, all of these things are where the questions I'd like to ask.
Thank you very much, Jeffers. It was interesting for us Estonians to listen how we were analyzed, especially I was speaking and thinking. I just wanted to add some aspects. One about the gender, because you by himself had a recording by a male singer who used the same way of ingressive breathing because he had no choice. Another choice is to make pauses between phrases, and it is as well spread practice when regular singers sing alone. But due to Veliotormis, the special way of breathing during the verse is picked up and promoted and used in contemporary regular singing. Actually, as well known was singing breathing between phrases, but it was not as exciting and therefore not used so much. So actually, not everybody did breathe during the verse. And as you said, it was not used as aesthetical mean during traditional regular singing because actually it was not heard because it happened during choir part. So actually people make use of the regular feature but didn't exist in traditional practice because it was rather hidden than promoted in traditional practice. And if you listen to set recordings, multi-channel recordings, then you can listen different strategies of leader, how she breathes during the choir part. Sometimes she makes a pause, sometimes she continues singing, just not to lose, I think, a verse and trace and to go naturally on after some breathing. And what more? That's all at the moment.
Yeah. No, I think what I agree actually. Sorry,
Sorry, one more thing I wanted to say. It was about the difference ingressive singing during the syllable and just breathing. There is not so strict difference because it is about the last syllable. Then a singer sometimes has a kind of sound during breathing in. She tries to say the syllable, sometimes we don't hear it, but actually the singer doesn't make consciously different. Sometimes we hear a little bit more with vowel, or sometimes we don't, but the singer makes the same. It just depends how it comes or how it happens. Sometimes it's sometimes.
Yeah.
And perhaps I misunderstood that you said that we didn't have a word or didn't notice that practice in Estonia. We have a word, we say siste hingatud siit või siste hingamise ajalauldud siit, and we write it down in our regular transcriptions. We use a special note for that. So, yes.
That's great. This was one of the questions.
You can discover in our regular publications in Vanemuise and our transcriptions. We use an empty note usually, or a note in the text use different script or brackets or different letters or something like this.
Thank you very much. That was one question I could not answer ahead of time. I found this spoken Estonian transcription rubric where they do the the period before ingressive words, but so that was, thank you very much. This was one of my big questions. When I said not having a word, that was much more sort of the speaking with people who don't think about this every day, Estonians on the street, who the woman who I was recording there in the bits that I played earlier. I think the fact that, you know, average Estonian doesn't have a word readily at hand for this practice makes it that much more interesting and important, because it's a second nature aspect of the speech. And just one more comment about, I very much agree. So part of the thing is it's hard to determine sometimes, you know, is this ingressive phonation or is it just a dropped syllable with breathing? So sometimes as I did my own listening, it was quite hard to determine like what I thought I was hearing. Was it ingressive? Was it intentionally ingressive, or was it just a syllable that's trailed off with breath? So that's an interesting sort of nuance zone as well. And it's also harder to find examples, at least in the available archival materials that I had. It's harder to find examples of sort of really good examples of ingressive versus people who do drop a syllable right at the last syllable of a verse to breathe in the sort of regular place between a verse, or to add a little bit of extra time. So there's definitely this sort of counter performance practice. What I think is interesting is that thanks to Tormis and others, there's something that became appealing about sisengamine in the middle of verses, to make this sort of the approach that to my mind seems to be gaining symbolic meaning in with newer singers. But I completely agree with your point, and thank you for pointing me to this. That was my golden question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for coffee break now. 10 minutes.